What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. This is Eric, also known as Crazy Crab. We're going to go over this game right here. And this is a game where my opponent, and this has been happening quite a bit lately, and it happens all the time really, but for whatever reason, people are just very greedy and they want to go pawn hunting. And my opponent goes pawn hunting in this particular game, allows me to promote, sees my pawn moving up the board, and instead continues to grab pawns. This has actually happened earlier this week, and it just happened again, and it's just something I never can understand why opponents do this. And if you see your opponent doing this, allow them to take the pawns and just win the game. And I'll show you an example of how this will happen. And if you're the one grabbing pawns, stop grabbing pawns. Stop going for loose pawns when it worsens your position, especially when it's clear that your opponent is moving a pawn up the board or something like that. Or if your opponent's going to checkmate you, don't go pawn grabbing. It's just stupid. These pawns are not that important, especially when you're about to lose the game. And in this particular game, I actually had a worse position, and my opponent just decided, I want to go grab these pawns. Well, enjoy your pawns. You're going to get checkmated. So let's check it out. So this is how it started. And I'm not going to get too deep into the opening. I'm pretty much going to run through this really quick because it doesn't really matter. But I played Albin-Counter Gambit, and my opponent played some moves I hadn't seen before. And at the end of the day, I ended up with a terrible pawn structure. So after some exchanges, this is what the position looked like. So I'm not playing too well myself, but at least right here, I have the same amount of material after he takes this pawn. I'm up a pawn, but we're about to be completely even in material, and he's going to have a pretty easy time mopping up these pawns right here. So I play my rook over here from A to B8, just trying to target a pawn myself. And I figured if he moves forward, I can go ahead and grab it. So, you know, yeah, he's going to grab this pawn, but hey, let's just see what we can do here. But he goes ahead and grabs the pawn anyway, and that's not the worst move. I grab his pawn. I thought he was going to grab my pawn, but he castled here. It's a good move, you know, just getting his king safe and getting ready to come and destroy me. But then I grab the last pawn here, and at this point, I think I have at least drawing chances, and possibly I can get back in this game with these three pawns. I have three pawns. He has none over here on this side of the board. But after he grabs this pawn, I see that this pawn's going to pretty much fall. Now, I'm not going to be greedy and play something like rook to c8 to hang on to that pawn. That didn't feel like a good move to me. Felt like a good move to me is start my trip to the homeland. Besides, I can't hang on to this pawn. This rook's going to come over. This pawn is falling. So I play a5. I'm going for it, you know. Not going to worry about the pawns that don't matter, such as this pawn, such as this pawn. This is my baby right here. This is the guy who has the best chance. So he's heading home. And I figured if he wants to be greedy, he'll grab this pawn, just get rid of it, which is exactly what he does. It's not the worst move just yet, but already I'm thinking like, is this guy just going to go pawn hunting this whole time? I'm going to keep on rolling. Now, he has to see what I'm trying to do. He has to see that I'm trying to promote here with my pawn. You'd have to be an idiot not to see what my goal is. I even have this rook here helping it out. I have this rook that's about to come over and help it out if it can. This rook can move to the side. This pawn can come home, okay? And with this rook protecting, it's bad. He has to stop me now. He has to bring his rook over here to c1. He has to do something. What does he do? Rook c6. What's the point? You guessed it. Take more pawns. More pawns that don't matter. This pawn's not going anywhere. This pawn can't do anything. Why are you targeting this pawn when you see me running up the board? Sure enough, after I play rook to a8, adding even more strength to this pawn and allowing my other rook to move to the side so this guy can promote, what does he do? He takes another pawn. He takes that pawn that had absolutely was doing nothing here. This pawn was doing nothing. I didn't even bother protecting it. I wanted him to take the pawn. I briefly thought about king g7, but I said, well, I want him to take this pawn. I would love for him to take this pawn. Thank you. And now I believe I'm completely winning here. In fact, yeah, I'm winning here. I have a winning advantage now. He could still try to fight back. He still has a material advantage technically because he grabbed this pawn, but that's just a stupid move. Of course, I'm going to move my rook over here and make a nice path. So he brings his rook over here. And at this point, the crazy thing is, because of this move, this rook is just so out of play. It can't even come back up here to the first rank because this pawn blocks it. It can't come over here because I'll take it. It has to come over to one of these squares and then try to somehow get back into the game. But it is so misplaced here on f6 because it wanted to grab this pawn that was doing nothing and was not going to be doing anything for some time. a3, I'm going home. Stop me. And here he's just so slow to get back in the game. Rook d6, and of course a2. It's just there's nothing he can do. Yeah, he brought his rook up here. I thought for a minute. I figured, okay, obviously I just line up my rooks here. He still can't take this. He won't take this. This guy is very greedy. He is not going to take this pawn, even though it might be his best option at this point. He plays insane g3. I mean, look, rook here. He's still not going to take this pawn, even because he knows he's completely losing if he does, but he's completely losing anyway. He moves his king out of here, and after a little think, I just figure, okay, I'll just take this rook here, because if he takes back, then I can play my rook up to b1, and if he wants to take here, he can go ahead and do that, and I'll have his 2 rooks to his 1. He does take there, rook up to b1, and still not willing to take my rook. He goes ahead and throws in the check, king to b7. Of course, he didn't take my rook because he knew I had queen, but now rook to a8. Oh, yeah, I'm just going to let you take that. No, I don't think so. I have my queen now. He takes the queen, and I take, and now I have my rook, and he has nothing but pawns, and his pawns are way back here. And I still have a couple of pawns and a king. With the rook, that's more than enough to go ahead and win the game. And appropriately enough, just run through this. Appropriately enough, I wanted to make it so that he would grab my last pawn. I wanted to end that way, and this was the final position. And I knew he was going to take this pawn. I just knew it. Which, even if he didn't, of course, I was still completely winning. But if he takes this pawn, I have a beautiful forced mate, because after this move, he can't go here, he can't go here, he can't go up here because of the rook. He has to go here, which you already see is the end of the game. Checkmate. So, guys, I'm not a grandmaster, I'm not a master, I'm not anything like that. Common sense. Don't go pawn grabbing if you see your opponent is going to promote. I'm moving my pawn up the board and he goes grabbing pawns. Why are people so greedy? It's one thing if you want to ever advance your game and become better, which I do, you got to stop being greedy and just grabbing loose pawns. Worry about the position. And there's nothing I love more than when my opponents just go grabbing my pawns and I just win the game. So, you know, don't do that. And if your opponent is doing that, let him take the pawns. I could have played my king up to g7 earlier in this game to try to protect that pawn. Why? I wanted him to take the pawn. His first mistake was moving his rook over to c1, being greedy to grab this pawn. I can forgive that mistake, but the second mistake over here, this one was just terrible. Going over here, first of all, moving up here to c6 to grab this pawn, and then even after I moved over to rook a8, he still grabbed the pawn. Oh my God! This guy's rated 1709. How did you get to 1709? Have a great day. Talk to you later.